On the outskirts of Wichita, Kansas, a building looms. Dark windowed, with walls of polished granite, it hulks above the surrounding landscape. This is the headquarters of Koch Industries. Wichita locals refer to it as the Tower. From its early acquisition of an inordinately profitable oil refinery to its current standing as the second largest privately held corporation in the United States, this physical institution is an apt symbol for Koch Industries itself, which is as secretive as it is successful. On November 17, 1967, Fred Koch, the wealthy head of a relatively humble business empire, was hunting near Bear River, Utah, accompanied by a field guide. The story goes that Fred downed a duck, indulged in a moment of self-congratulation, and then fell over, unconscious. There were no hospitals in that wilderness. He died where he fell. He was survived by his wife Mary and their 4 sons. His sons, Frederick Jr., the eldest, Charles, the second-born, and Bill and David, the twin babies of the family, weren't surprised when Fred died. He'd been unwell for years, during which time he'd been grooming his favored heir, Charles. Charles began working for his father's company in 1961 after obtaining an engineering degree from MIT and working as a management consultant in Boston. When Fred died, 32-year-old Charles was the obvious successor. Detail-oriented and mathematically gifted, he made for a much better fit than his elder brother Frederick Jr., who, living in New York, was more interested in matinees than in math. David and Bill, junior to Charles by 5 years, were still too young. And so, in 1967, Charles took command of Fred Koch's sprawling array of assets. These included an engineering company, a network of pipelines, multiple ranches, and an oil collection enterprise. When Charles took the reins, he made 2 major moves. First, he consolidated all his father's loosely connected corporate entities into a single business called Koch Industries, a name as inconspicuous as the company itself. The name served to deflect rather than attract attention. This was by design. As CEO, Charles would never rely on ostentatious branding or overt innovation. He preferred to fly low, below the public radar. His next move was to make an acquisition that would provide much of the cash that enabled him to pursue his overarching vision for Koch Industries: massive, but quiet, growth. In 1969, Charles Koch acquired an oil refinery that served as his main profit center for decades to come. Among Koch Industries' assets was a minority share in an oil refinery located near the Pine Bend Bluffs natural area outside Minneapolis, Minnesota. This refinery hadn't seemed particularly special to Fred Koch, who'd been content to maintain his minority shareholding position. Charles, however, seemed to see its potential. In 1969, he bought out the other shareholders entirely. This acquisition would provide Koch Industries with a constant and reliable cascade of cash. It was, in the words of many Koch executives, the company's cash cow. Why was it so profitable? Well, for starters, it imported almost all its oil from Canada. Minnesota shares a border with Canada, which has sizable crude oil reserves. However, the crude oil of Canada is different from oil drilled in, say, Saudi Arabia or Texas. Canadian oil contains lots of sulfur and is thus called sour, whereas Texan and Saudi oil with low levels of sulfur is sweet. In the United States, there were only 4 refineries that had the equipment to process sour oil. Pine Bend was one of them. These geographic and infrastructural advantages were compounded by yet another advantage. Back in the 1950s, President Dwight Eisenhower passed a law intended to safeguard U.S. oil drillers. To prevent imported oil from undercutting the selling price of domestic product, he limited the amount of crude oil that U.S. refineries could legally import. But he left a loophole. The restriction didn't apply to Canada. This put Koch Industries in an outstanding position. There were few buyers for sour oil, so the price of Canadian crude remained relatively low, and since there were few refineries in Pine Bend's region, the price of refined oil was consistently high. Koch could buy cheap from Canada and sell dear in the United States. Future government regulations added advantage to advantage. In 1970, President Richard Nixon passed the Clean Air Act. This law severely limited the amount of pollutants refineries could legally emit, but it too contained a loophole. It only applied to new refineries. So not only could Pine Bend keep running at full capacity, it also had to worry even less about competition emerging. New low-emission equipment was so cost-prohibitive that since 1977, no new large-capacity refineries have been built in the United States. For Koch, this meant dollar signs. In 1981, Pine Bend generated 22% of Koch's annual earnings, $60.9 million after taxes. In 1982, when Koch took in $309.2 million, Pine Bend generated more than a third. This money made it possible for Koch to undertake its next move, expansion. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, Charles began quietly expanding Koch Industries, purchasing oil pipelines, barges, and trucking services, all of which eventually came to constitute a subdivision called Koch Oil. By 1988, Koch Oil had established itself as the United States' largest purchaser of crude oil. Major oil companies such as Exxon and Chevron often had no choice but to use Koch Oil's services to transport oil from their wells, especially in remote locations. Koch Oil was simply the only transporter available. Meanwhile, Charles's unique access to market information enabled him to make further savvy acquisitions, a new oil refinery among them. As a straightforward oil processing plant, this refinery, located in Corpus Christi, Texas, lacked Pine Bend's advantages. It couldn't process sour oil, for instance. But Koch saw a less obvious advantage. It possessed the equipment necessary to produce a hydrocarbon compound called paraxylene. Paraxylene is one of those products that's invisible but invaluable. It's used to make a range of chemicals that are as crucial as they are unpronounceable. Polyethylene terephthalate, for instance, is used to make synthetic fibers for plastic bottles and food packaging, products that were in increasingly high demand in the early 1980s. From his privileged vantage point in the market, Koch saw something the Corpus Christi refinery owners seemed to have missed. The demand for paraxylene was growing. In 1981, Koch Industries bought the Corpus Christi refinery for $265 million. Almost immediately, paraxylene production at the plant doubled. Such expansion defined Koch Industries for more than 2 decades. This fixation on physical growth and financial gain also had its dark side. In the late 1980s, Koch Industries was accused of oil theft, but the case was ultimately dropped. In 1988, the U.S. Senate opened an investigation into a case of alleged oil theft on Indian reservations. The year before, an article published in the Arizona Republic had strongly implied that major oil firms such as Chevron and Exxon were exploiting a federal system that permitted them to drill on Native American land and then self-report the amount drilled. According to the article, large quantities of oil, millions of dollars worth, had gone unreported. Federal investigators were shocked when their investigation turned up nothing. If someone was stealing, it turned out, it wasn't big oil. The oil companies were the victims of the crime they'd been accused of. The real thief was Koch Industries. It turned out that the major oil firms were well acquainted with what Koch Oil's gaugers, the people who drained the wells and trucked the oil away, called the Koch method. Every time a Koch oil gauger took oil from one of their wells, he recorded the well's oil level before and after he drained it. The Koch method allegedly involved 2 steps: cutting the top and bumping the bottom. The former dictated that, before draining the well, gaugers record the level of oil as an inch lower than the actual level. The latter step required that after draining the well, they record an inch higher. The result? 2 inches of free oil. These inches added up. In 1988, in Oklahoma alone, Koch Oil didn't pay for 142,000 barrels of oil. In 1986, it was 240,680 barrels. Koch Oil wasn't alone in its overages, but other companies' excesses were negligible and probably inadvertent. In 1987, the next largest overage was 2,181 barrels, or 0.009% of what Koch trucked off. The Senate investigation eventually died. In early interviews, oil gaugers had told federal investigators that they'd been pressured to overmeasure in continuous improvement meetings. The case hinged on establishing that this pressure came from the executive level. The documents that might have proved this connection were accidentally destroyed, however, and gaugers suddenly began recanting, saying they'd never heard of the Koch method. The grand jury of Oklahoma ultimately dismissed the case, citing insufficient evidence. In the late 1990s, Koch Industries was heavily fined for a series of environmental law violations. For Koch Industries, the be-all and end-all was maximal production. The approach was profitable, but it led to a series of environmental law violations as well as a fatal accident. In 1996, Pine Bend process owner Brian Roos became aware of a problem. Responsible for the refinery's wastewater treatment plant, Roos noticed that the ammonia levels in the millions of gallons of wastewater had spiked. Ammonia is a byproduct of the oil refining process, and Pine Bend was permitted to release a certain amount of it into the nearby Mississippi River. To maximize production, Pine Bend kept its ammonia levels right below the legal limit. But this approach was risky. If ammonia levels rose, for instance, there would be no time to purify the water sufficiently before draining it into the river. With ammonia levels through the roof, Roos had two choices: shut down production and do a thorough search for the cause of the issue, or keep production high and find a workaround. He went with the workaround, which involved draining the insufficiently purified water into surrounding wetlands. In the end, state and federal agents found out. In 1998, Koch Industries was fined $6.9 million by the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency. An additional $6 million criminal fine for the illegal water dumping followed in 1999, along with a requirement to pay an additional $2 million to Minnesota's Dakota County Park System. Such violations weren't unique to Pine Bend. Neglected pipeline systems were responsible for 312 oil spills over the course of 8 years, resulting in $30 million in fines. Most tragically, a Texas pipeline explosion killed 2 teenagers. One family sued, winning a $296 million judgment, though they ended up settling for an undisclosed amount. These were historic numbers, but Koch Industries could handle the fines. Koch Industries' vast political influence apparatus killed a bill that would have capped greenhouse gas emissions. Throughout the late 2000s and early 2010s, Charles Koch was less preoccupied with profits than he was with politics. When he spoke of the Obama administration, it was in dire terms. He called the run-up to the 2012 presidential election the mother of all wars for the life or death of this country. This pronouncement was made at a conference in Palm Springs, California, before a crowd of rich, right-leaning donors and conservative politicians, the generals and soldiers who would be waging this war. By this point, it was well established that David and Charles Koch commanded an immense political influence apparatus, which, with their funding, was shaping the political landscape to serve the brothers' free market priorities. This apparatus included a Washington, D.C. lobbying office, multiple think tanks, and, notably, Americans for Prosperity. This was an activist group that, in the first 2 years of Obama's presidency, played a key role in killing a bill that sought to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. This bill, called the American Clean Energy and Security Act, or ACES, was a cap-and-trade bill that sought to impose a limit on the volume of pollutants that a company could release. If a company wanted to exceed this limit, it would have to buy credits for pollution above the cap. On the other hand, if a company stayed below the cap, it could earn credits, which it could then sell to other companies. In essence, the bill would create a new market for pollution. After the bill was approved by the House of Representatives in June 2009, Koch Industries set out to kill it before it reached the Senate. Koch was an important donor to many Republican senators. It provided funds indirectly, of course, by holding fundraisers for senators willing to push its priorities. Throughout 2009, Koch pressured multiple Republican senators who might have approved ACES, threatening to cease holding fundraisers for those who didn't toe the line. Americans for Prosperity, meanwhile, organized transportation for and gave information to disgruntled voters. At town hall meetings, politicians amenable to the bill were shocked to see hundreds of voters, many of them shouting the same thing: no cap and tax. This was more than bizarre. Not only were such meetings usually sparsely attended, but ACES had only just reached the Senate floor for debate. In the end, the bill died. Not with a bang, but with a quiet whimper that had Koch written all over it. Charles Koch's fortune more than doubled during the Obama years, thanks in part to fracking. If, to use Charles Koch's words, the Obama years threatened the life of this country, they certainly didn't threaten the life of his corporation. When Obama assumed the presidency, Charles's half of the Koch fortune was about $19 billion. When Obama left office, it had more than doubled. Koch's key assets, like Pine Bend and Georgia Pacific, were at the core of this growth. But the newfound viability of a relatively old technology added significantly to the flow of cash. Hydraulic fracturing, or fracking, was invented in the 1970s. But it wasn't until 2008, when the price of oil reached a record high of $145 per barrel, that the expensive technology became financially viable. By 2010, fracking was enabling drillers to reach natural gas and oil deposits that had previously seemed inaccessible. Koch Industries cashed in by taking a gamble. After careful analysis, Koch determined that a section of land in southern Texas called Eagle Ford Shale might, with the use of fracking, render significant amounts of oil. What's more, this oil would be light crude, which the Corpus Christi plant just so happened to use as a feedstock for paraxylene production. Initial estimates predicted oil yields of between 100,000 and 200,000 barrels of crude per day. It wasn't certain, but Koch decided to act anyway. It built 2 pipelines between Eagle Ford and Corpus Christi, one capable of carrying 120,000 barrels per day and the other 200,000. It also bought Ingleside Pier, which would enable it to ship 200,000 barrels per day from Corpus Christi on oil barges. Hundreds of millions of dollars went into the project, and Koch still didn't know whether there would be any oil. Then the frackers arrived. By summer 2010, Eagle Ford was producing 82,000 barrels per day. By 2012, it was up to 811,000. By 2014, 1.68 million barrels were leaving Eagle Ford daily. Fracking set off a revolution in the U.S. oil industry. In 2005, the United States was the largest importer of refined petroleum products. By 2015, it was the largest exporter of those same products. Fracking revolutionized the U.S. oil market, and the resultant profits poured straight into the coffers of legacy oil companies like Koch. In 2018, Charles Koch's worth was estimated at $53.5 billion, and his fortune is still growing.